This whole war with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the United States is playing out all across Africa, where China has gone in and under the Belt and Road program has taken over airports and harbors and they have brought cheap money in there and they have sold projects to African governments that they believe are in keeping with their stature, but which they neither need nor can afford. And when they default on those loans, China takes all that critical infrastructure. So you have that part of the Marxist takeover that's happening, and then just the other part of it is where that to add to what your Kenyan philosopher was saying. Look at all of the organizations across the West and in this country, from USAID to World Economic to, the WWO, but beyond that, to all of these individual organizations that say we're raising money for schools in Africa or for wells in Africa, or for this. Show me one country in Africa, show me one animal that's been saved. Show me one village where they no longer have a sanitation problem. Show me one country where the education is now no longer an issue because of the billions and billions of dollars that have been poured in. You can't, they don't exist. They absolutely don't exist. So what the West has done is create a system of aid that is indentured servitude. It keeps countries enslaved.
Exactly.
It doesn't reach the people.
This is the liberal economic order.
It's theft. Yeah. On a massive scale. So they'll take your tax dollars and they'll hold fundraisers and they'll hold big events in New York and they'll trot out the little black kids who look so cute on camera and they say we're saving them. But I've been to those places. I've worked in Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, Lesotho, Swaziland, Burundi, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, obviously, Zambia, Zimbabwe, you name it, and beyond, all the way up to the north. I have never been to a village where you've had aid organizations that have been there for 10, 20, 30, 40, now 50 years, where anyone is actually better off.
And it traps them in a cycle of poverty because it disincentivizes work. Yep. You don't need to go out and do something because there's some Bill Gates Foundation is going to come and give you whatever you need.
But what they've also been doing is coming in and saying, "Oh, we'll help you with the farming, but you have to farm GMO seeds," and so which is another form of indentured servitude because the seeds are not self-generating, and so these farmers are now 100% dependent, on this organization, the Gates Foundation or Warren Buffett, And by the way, they bring in this highly sophisticated, mechanized, digital farming and farming equipment in places that don't even have electricity. So how is that supposed to be maintained and sustained? And they have relied on corruption and greed and ideology, Marxist ideology. It's much easier for you to say, okay, race is the problem. And if you look at it historically, Vladimir Lenin sent his emissaries all over the world to identify fissures in societies that could be exploited. In Algeria, it was Islam. In most of the world, it was race. In the United States, it was race. And so in South Africa, it was race. So that's why civil rights movements are so commonly associated with Marxism. And Nelson Mandela himself was a Marxist. And so was the ANC, a Marxist organization. Now the Electronic Freedom Frontier, Julius Malema, who's made he's now famous for saying kill the farmer, kill the Boer. He didn't create that saying, but look what that was about.
It's an ANC saying. Yep.
It's an ANC saying, which was the ruling party. But what is it really in its origins? It is a saying that is meant to divide the society, because South Africans, I have to say two things are really important. The vast majority of people who suffer on a daily basis from the violent crime are Black people, which doesn't mean there isn't a genocide, but it is important to acknowledge that. And the other thing is to acknowledge, again, that in spite of the segregation, South Africa is a very integrated society. Just because out of the sheer numbers, and there is a great love between the people, in spite of their best efforts to divide people, there is an enormous amount of love and goodwill among all races in South Africa.
The reason why I asked about winter is that, when I look at the planet, it seems southern enough relative to the northern hemisphere to get a normal winter. And I was just looking up why it doesn't, and it's because of ocean currents and elevation relative to the northern hemisphere. The Mediterranean is a little bit warm despite them being relatively northern. But there's a theory I wonder if you all have heard of. You mentioned that this philosophy where if you're facing a problem, you can either solve it or live with it. Mm-hmm. And one of the theories that I read is that cultures that had harsh winters they built their society around the need to constantly, you're in a constant state of detriment and panic, in that even if you have a big pile of food, you're feeling like you don't have enough. And this comes from if you were to survive a winter in the north, if you said, you know what, we got enough food for the summer, winter would come, you die. So the only civilizations that persist were those that said, we have to have more than we need. This is more likely to say the problem has to be fixed, otherwise we die tomorrow. But in places like the Mediterranean and in places like Africa where it's warm and there's year-round fishing and there's year-round fruit, you don't have to have that because you don't have the harsh winter where you're going to struggle to survive. So one theory as to why Liberia fails is that this culture that they're handed, it's like, here's an American Constitution. They say, yeah, but so what? There's going to be food. There's going to be fish. Why should we struggle and pressure ourselves when we could just relax?
Yeah. So there's a story with towards the end of the Soviet Union when Gorbachev, at the time of the perestroika, they had some conversations about how to maintain socialism. And one of his advisors said, what we need in Russia is Swedish socialism. And then Gorbachev said, but where are we going to get all the Swedes? and it's sort of the equivalent of saying, so we're just going to make Liberia an American country. But then the question is, where are we going to get all the Americans? Because it's not American. It's not an American country, which means that the outcomes would be different because of cultural dynamics. And culture is a complicated thing, and it's a controversial thing also to discuss. And I think in the South African context, it's very difficult to try to analyze what is happening there without considering cultural dynamics. And there are different reasons why different cultures reach different conclusions. And this certainly could be one of them, is weather conditions and so forth. But I would say in the African context, there are other threats or risks, such as just wildlife, at least not today as much, but I mean years ago, centuries ago, like you were constantly under risk of being eaten by a lion or trampled by an elephant or something. So there were other risks.
Or a hippo.
Or a hippo, yeah.
Or a crocodile in the water.
Yeah, and mosquitoes, then of course.
Malaria.
Yeah.
But also the other thing is economies of scale. I don't think you can underestimate the significance of that. Because in the United States, things that are just very easy to get and cheap are much harder to get in South Africa because economies of scale make them very difficult to produce competitively. So that's a big factor. And then the other thing is that we talked about this, Ernst, on the way over here, is having a constitution and a democracy without a republic is doomed to fail. Because it's really the republic that is in itself the checks and balances of the democracy that ensure the equality that you're talking about, that people get equal opportunities. And Liberia it's not a federal system. It doesn't have states that have state rights. I don't think you can overestimate the impact that states' rights have in balancing out federal power in the United States. And I've never been anywhere else in the world, and I've been to many places. I've never been anywhere that has a system like the United States where there is such a strong both political and legal and cultural identity for the different regions while still having this shared identity.
Is the Marxist goal just to destroy? Is it just, demons that are like, let's ruin everything and burn down civilization?
Well, yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Yes,
I was just going to say.
Okay, he said yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of like what you saw with ChatGPT when you asked it a very basic question about South Africa, and then it responds like full-blown defense. And you get this in the press in the West all the time about South Africa, is it's an issue that uniquely animates the left and the West, is the South Africa issue. And it's kind of like what you talked about, because what's at stake for the order that exists in America and the UK, Europe at large, is if South Africa in this current iteration fails, then that's a huge indictment of their system. Exactly. Because they went from a European dominated system to it, and they're trying to implement this liberal system into a group that's not used to it, quite frankly. So if this fails, I mean, it's a huge blow to the liberal world order, so to speak.
So I want to add to that. Then South Africa became South Africa as we know it today in 1994, which was just shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the conclusion then was communism had been defeated and will be globally replaced by liberal democracy. And then Francis Fukuyama famously wrote The End of History, saying that, that's going to be the future. We're now at the end point of human development. We're all going to standardize we're all going to be liberals. And it was at the height of this hype when the South African Constitution was written, with the assumption that actually we're all just the same and we're all just going to become the same. And that's why it's in a very important way. I think you mentioned the open society right at the beginning. South Africa is a good example of the sort of an open society experiment. It was at the hype of this theory that it was constituted. And I have a sort of anecdote on that. The first time I came to America was in 2012, and I spoke at an event at the United Nations in New York. I participated in a conference, and someone sort of pulled me to the side and said that it was someone who worked at the UN, a pretty senior guy, and he said to me, "Look, I see what you're trying to do, but don't do it." Or he said to me, "It's not going to work." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said that some of us can see that the cracks are showing in South Africa, but you have to understand that for us, South Africa is the example that should be followed by the world in terms of ideology, in terms of the political system, in terms of the structure. So it's not in our interest. We don't want to talk about the problems in South Africa because that's sort of ideologically where we want to end up with, what we want to end up with. And now, in as far as it's failing, it creates a problem. And he was sort of weirdly on my side, trying to give some advice that it's not going to work. But now the failure is up to the point where you can't deny it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that's partly why it's so controversial to talk about the failure in South Africa, because it shouldn't fail, because theoretically it's good, but it's not.
I'm so over this, as Tate was bringing up, the media's defensive reaction to honest questions, or how weird it was that ChatGPT decided to inject huge essays on things I didn't ask about. It does this on issues of institutional importance when the institutions want. I don't care if the corporate press wants to insult me and claim I'm a conspiracy theorist because I ask a question or report on things that are actually happening in that country. So when we look at the political structures of this country, there's this in the United States. I don't know where it comes from. I'm sure people have ideas. But the issue of apartheid, for instance, the idea of segregation in the United States is bad. It's abhorrent. We fought. We put an end to it. We had the Civil Rights Act, all of these good things, which I'm grateful for because my family actually went through all of that. But when apartheid ends, let me start off. I'll put it this way. I met a young woman 20 years ago in Chicago who had fled South Africa. And I was, why would you flee your country? Like, what's going on in South Africa? And she said, because of the rapes, because you're more likely to be raped than learn how to read. And so this is those are the stats. At least at the time, I don't know if it's changed. And so she fled the country, found work somewhere else, and got out. And I also saw the film Stander with Tom Jane, which is awesome, and I recommend it. Whether you care about South Africa or not, it's an amazing movie. He's a bank robber. He's like Dillinger, and it's true. Yeah. Dramatized, of course. And so I started to read about this stuff, and I'm not. This is mid 2000s internet. This is not weird, whatever the media wants to call conspiracy theory, great replacement, garbage nonsense. I literally was like, I want to read about what happened. And I started reading about baby rape, how there are people who believe that if you have AIDS, you can transfer it to a baby by infecting them with the disease. And I started asking myself, how does this happen? And then, of course, I read about the expansion of crime following the end of apartheid. And I say, okay, it's not something I followed tremendously or anything. But later in the years, when the story starts to become more prominent in the United States, largely with people pushing the idea of white genocide or whatever they wanted to call it, which I know you say is contentious and not accurate to a certain degree, the media immediately starts getting defensive and saying, no, you can't talk about this. So it makes me then start to wonder, why? I mean, there's clearly something going on that has people talking, but why is the immediate reaction from everyone in the press, shut your mouth? And that, I think, creates a bigger and bigger interest in the story. And it makes people feel like there is an intentional action among world governments to silence those who might bring up the fact that maybe their plans aren't working the way they expected them to, or maybe the plans are working the way they expected them to, and they're horrifying. Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.